And how did you react and adapt, obviously, when the pandemic first happened?
There was actually a massive adaptation. I mean, aside from the technological and the physical working from home, content-wise, we really had to look at what we were doing, especially lifestyle-wise. You know, we're talking about travel, we're talking about beauty procedures, we're talking about, you know, going to the shops and buying things, activities, everything. So we had to basically clear out loads of content that's all just been dumped, unfortunately, and sort of start from scratch.
And one of the most common things that we're hearing at the moment is that it's quite difficult to get through to journalists. Are you still taking phone calls? What is the best way for us to reach you?
It is so hard to get hold of journalists. I appreciate that. I'm actually a really good journalist because I answer my phone even if I don't know who's calling me, which is probably why I got my credit card scammed. Don't fall for that. But it's really hard. Like, I took one day off and I had 100 emails just land in my inbox in that time, and I think I deleted some throughout the day, or like just kept on top of them. So it's really hard. Phone calls are very rarely answered. I mean, if you know the journalist, perhaps you can do that. It's worth emailing is the best thing, but what you put in the title of your email will really help. That kind of, you know, just flagging what it is, like, you know, if it's a pitch for an idea, if it's a new product, if it's just give the journalist a reason to open your email over the other 500 that they've got. Obviously, if you've got a personal relationship or if you've worked with them before, they might see your name in the inbox. But often I email my editor and she doesn't see my emails because she's got about 1,000 unread emails. So,
and just out of interest, how many emails do you get on a daily basis?
God, I don't know. I mean, like I said, probably, you know, a good 200, and I'm not, because, you know, I'm sort of deputy, whatever. I'm not getting a lot of the other emails, and I'm also a bit of an inbox kind of control. I like to get my inbox down. Other people have got like 6,000 unread emails, but that sends me into a tailspin.
Yeah, and I think I know that we've mentioned before you don't really tend to use social media that much yourself, but certainly other journalists, perhaps on the news desk. What about approaching journalists on social media, you know, and direct messaging on Twitter? Does that go down well?
Absolutely. I think it has its place, and often, I mean, I've got colleagues who put out media requests on Twitter. They prefer that to other sources. I mean, I use Response Source, but I think that's quite old-fashioned of me. But you know, Twitter is a great place where people put out their requests. And yeah, if you can grab a journalist's attention, why not direct message them on social media? And you can see, if you're following them on social media, you can see if they use it or not. You can see that, wrongly probably, that I'm not on Twitter, but it's Twitter storm out there, so I tend not to use it, but you can see
just thinking of perhaps those who are a bit less experienced as well, you know, and perhaps don't have established relationships with journalists. And we used to sort of rely very much on face-to-face networking, didn't we? And obviously at the moment in this world, we're unable to do that, to make those fruitful relationships. How would you suggest we best engage and build relationships with journalists during this time?
It is tricky, and I mean, and it is hard. Obviously, you can't sort of, you know, say, oh, do you fancy a coffee? Do you want to meet up for lunch? But actually, even pre-pandemic, we're so tight. We're so tight for time. It's really hard to get that FaceTime with a journalist anyway. I'm just trying to think, you know, I've had some PRs sometimes, if they've sort of sent something a bit creative, will kind of grab my attention. That extra level of creativity, or just a real knowledge of what I'm looking for. You know, I get a lot of tech sent to me. We very rarely cover tech. You know, if you're speaking to the right journalist and you've got the right product or client for them, you are going to get heard over than if you're just, we can tell when you're just sort of scattergun anyone's name that you've got and you're just putting your product or your client out there. It's really clear, because it's not aimed at us. It's not, you know, our section hasn't been read. You don't know what we cover, and you've positioned your client, even if they might be relevant somehow else, you've positioned them in a really irrelevant way, and we don't have time for that. So that's kind of a bit of a negative response to, but it is hard. It is hard to get our attention. I do appreciate it.
I think, funny enough, we've just had a question which mentions lead times for articles, and actually I was going to mention that from my own experience of working as a journalist and on news desks as well, that lead times are really important to consider. And I think, from being pitched to myself as well, that you have to have an awareness when you are pitching of what that lead time is. So I'll just go back to that question in a minute, but we've got another question here from Nita Shah. Do journalists check their junk folders just in case our emails have slipped into there, conscious of chasing or resending, but aware that sometimes emails do slip the net?
I mean, that's a really valid point. And Nita, I don't check my junk mail. I actually forgot I had a junk mail at one point. I have so much email that I didn't actually check my junk, and I wouldn't. If it's in junk, I've just let it go, because otherwise I would probably go insane. There's always, just send a follow-up email. If after the second one we've ignored it as well, you can probably take that as a no. But sometimes when people have emailed me twice, it has jogged my memory. It has made me give something a second look. So I mean, why not? I suppose. I think the third or the fourth one, I think there is a frustrating tendency where I get from PRs now where they're like, can you let me know either way? And I'm a bit like, I tell everybody no because they want to feature some cat food in my section, or I will run out of time to do my actual job. So I think always send a second email. Why not? If you don't try, then you're not going to get anywhere. But I think after the second email, let that one go.
Okay, that's really good to know. Very helpful.
Yeah, we've got some more questions. We've got one from John Clements. He said, are there any particular hot topics at the moment that are riding high on the media agenda, especially what is non-pandemic related? Which is a good question.
We're in such a difficult position a lot because we're lifestyle. So the pandemic, obviously it's everywhere, but we don't want everything really gloomy and pandemic related. However, we can't cover stuff that just is completely irrelevant to people because they're locked down. So it's a really fine line. Hot topics are well-being, mental health. Obviously, we genuinely care about our readers. We don't want them to be suffering. Connections, we're trying to encourage people to make connections with other people, and it's just seeing our readers through to the other side, and also recognizing that they're going through a hard time financially, probably psychologically, juggling caring for kids, maybe worried about elderly parents, and it's just offering that level of support to them through our content, and whether that's actual sort of advice or products that can help them, or even just a distraction and taking their mind off it, but all the while recognizing that we're in a pandemic.
And everything's evolving so quickly, isn't it? I think, day to day we're in lockdown, we're out of lockdown. I know here in Manchester we've been in tier 2 for 3 months or whatever it was, then we went to tier 3 and now into lockdown. So I think obviously you've got such a different reflection of readers across the UK, but we're now kind of at one again together. But has that sort of, the pandemic, changed your lead time? Are you looking for stuff much quicker and faster turnaround? Is that sort of happening now?
Ironically, we've gone the other way, but that's because we're losing so many members of staff that we're having to consolidate a lot of teams. And so we've got the tricky balance of planning content in advance, but then having to not risk it being out of date. So we have to play it very safe. I know other publications though will have a shorter lead time. So yes, they will be looking to turn around other things so they can, if something happens, they can then turn around fairly fast. We often look to celebrities to see what they're doing even now, and they're quite a good peg. If you're looking for a way in, if you can tell us that quite a well-known celebrity who's right for our publication, so it's not going to be someone who's too young or not well-known or too American, but they're doing something, and then we can then use that as a hook or a peg to then hang a feature off, and it's relevant. So there's always ways that you can set the agenda a bit more, or you can see what's happening around and help us set the agenda.
So still sort of piggybacking on topical things that celebrities are doing, whether that's Marcus Rashford or somebody else that's...
Absolutely, yeah.
And we've got a question here from Lauren. She said she appreciates journalists are very busy and looking for ways to turn stories and interviews around as quickly as possible. But what can we do in terms of information and content we can provide upfront with the chances of taking something forward? So I think that's probably, I had one again about standing out. You mentioned headlines. Is there anything else in particular, I suppose images and other content, or?
Yeah, I think if you're pitching like a real person, like to have a photo of them is always helpful. I think if you're going to say, hey, we've got this expert and they can give you great ways to survive the pandemic, I then have to email back and say, well, what are these great ways? Because until you tell me what the great ways are, I don't know whether I want to go forward with this. So it's that balance of putting enough content in, but not so much that when I open the email, I'm so overwhelmed and I've got like a 5-page essay to read because I just haven't got the time or the headspace for that. So I think it's how you kind of deliver what you're trying to get across. So it's great to have a headline, why it's relevant now, because Scarlett Johansson was doing something. Here are the 5 points that you would cover more in depth, or, you know, just give us the top line of what we need so we can process it really quickly. Think of us like 5-year-old children that you've only got our attention for a very small amount of time, and you've got to get what you can whilst you're there.
So more of a heading and bullet points or something, and then obviously if you want the rest of the information, you can ask for that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We've got a question here from Zach as well. It said, how has the pandemic affected magazines compared to other types of publications? And obviously we've heard of quite a few magazines that kind of gone bump, and online as well, but what's your experience at the moment?
Yeah, I don't know the exact circulation figures, but magazines have been struggling for a while, I think, with people not getting to the shops. However, people are now stuck at home. They've got a bit more spare time. They're looking for something to make them feel better. They're looking for something to read in the bath. So actually magazines are slightly becoming more relevant, bizarrely, but it's what's going into them. It's kind of, they're having to change their content. So they are being affected. Like I said at the beginning, all print media is being affected, but so many other industries.
Okay. That's good. And Lee, draw your hands back over to you. Have you got any more questions?
Yeah, so I wanted to mention desk drops to Debbie, actually, because I know that was something that a lot of our members have been talking about. You know, if journalists aren't in the office per se, what is the best way of gifting or, you know, doing an old-fashioned desk drop? Do they still work? I mean,
I find a desk drop actually quite useful because, like I said, if you work on the 5-year-old child basis, my office, you can't see, thankfully, I've got like books down one side, I've got products down another, and the thing is, don't send me irrelevant stuff, and also stuff that you can't ever guarantee a product appearing in it. But actually, I find it helpful if I do get sent something, because especially if they're books or something like that, I keep them, and then if I'm suddenly thinking I've got a half page to fill, I can sort of look that way. If I know that I've got a beauty spread on this to fill, or I want to do something on scalp care, and I look that way, and I've got, you know, if your soap or your shampoo is sitting there, it sounds awful, but it's just going to save me wading through my inbox. I do have separate, you know, files in my inbox, but then in the same way, you've got limited resource as well. We've got limited space. It's not like when we're in the office and we can just kind of clear it out. So it is a balance. And again, I suppose, just be really aware of what we cover. Is your product right for our publication? Is it in the right price range? Do we cover, like, don't send me, I don't know, something really, really expensive. It's not going to make it for our readers, or so that sort of thing. So yeah, they do actually help to catch our attention, but I recognise it's a gamble.
And what would you say has been the best story that you've covered, and how would you say that came to fruition?
I'm going to say one that's really helpful to you guys as PRs, because it was one of my favourite stories to write, and it was a really effective PR pitch, and it went in a couple of weeks ago, and it was kind of the house of the future, which is kind of stuff we don't necessarily do. And the PR was great, Sam, she was called, and she pitched me her client, who was Tom Cheesewright, and he's a futurist, and he talked about what our home's going to look like in 10 years time. We're all going to have like robot hoovers and wardrobes that fold the ironing, and it was fun and it was great. And you know what she did? She had this great headline on the email, so I wanted to open it. I was like, I want to know what my house is going to look like in the future. She had all these bullet points out. She said, you know, and so my interest was piqued already. So then I could go back to her and I just sort of said, what what else has he got to say? And she said he'd say all this, and then sent me a longer piece. And then I set up an interview with her client, and then we filled in the other gaps. But she pretty much got her client and everything he wanted to say, lock, stock, into the paper, and got covered in the Daily Express, the Daily Mirror, I think, and the Daily Record. And because there's a lot of content sharing nowadays as well, which is a good thing to be aware of. And, you know, I just thought it just made my life really easy. My editors loved it. Her client was happy, and it just worked really smoothly.
And also, I mean, I'm quite aware as well that a lot of people perhaps are nervous these days about picking up the phone to you. But what's the worst that can happen, right? You just don't answer.
I'm always nice. Yeah, to be fair, the worst thing that's going to happen is someone's going to be like, no, sorry, I'm not interested. They're more than likely not going to pick up the phone. I just say, yeah, it sounds really interesting, send me an email. And so, because it's quite hard to focus when I'm always doing two things at the same time. So if you're calling me, I'm obviously reading something on my screen or doing something else, and I will ask for an email, but then at least I'll recognise that email, and I will just have a skim read just to check what it is.
Okay. Sorry, I could just hear a little bit of feedback then coming from someone. Just a quick question here from Jonathan. Back to desktops, Debbie. Are most journalists happy to provide home addresses for sending?
It's really down to the journalist. I think we've got no option, to be honest with you. There's no option. Most of us, I think a few people are back in the office, not in my office. Most of us, well, not now anyway, but most of us are at home. So if you ask, some of us, I've got it on my signature, so that's always a good place to check. If you ask for the address and they give it to you, then great, you can send something. I mean, it really is down to the individual.
Is there like one bugbear that you have when it comes to being contacted? What's the biggest pet hate that you have? Come on, be honest.
It's the irrelevant stuff when they say this would be great for your motoring pages, and I'm like, I don't have any motoring pages. You've just wasted your time, my time, everyone's time. So and if you sort of don't read the section, the other bugbear is actually, and this is quite a relevant one, is that if we've just featured something, say we've just featured the top 10 cheeses, not the necessary word, we've just featured the top 10 cheeses, and then you phone me or email me going, hey, I've got a great cheese that would work for your, and I'm like, but because you've done this top 10 cheeses, so we can see that you like cheese, here's a cheese. And I'm like, well, no, that's clearly just gone. So you've missed that boat, unfortunately. So I guess it's not thinking that something is relevant because you've seen the exact same thing in the paper or the magazine. Just realise that that's a shame, and you're going to have to think of a different way to move your product or client on in order to fit.
We've got another question from Hannah Bright. Thanks, Debbie. This is so helpful. Do you find embedded releases and emails useful or overwhelming? That's a great question. Or do you not really notice if it's embedded?
What do you mean by embedded? Sorry, I'm really on tech. Just explain to me.
So that it's like, if you open
like not an attachment.
Yeah, not an attachment. It's actually all there, basically.
I think embedded is better than an attachment, I have to say. I mean, if it's going to crash my computer system, don't send it to me. If it's an attachment, you're right, I might not click on it. Other journalists might not click on it. So it's that kind of, it is a balance. Or what I often find does work is if you do that kind of bullet point headline, and if you want more information, here's the attachment. So you can go that way, or you can attach photos. What's really annoying actually is if I I'd like a low res image of something. If I want to see something and you've sent me a Google Drive is what's happening at the moment, a G Drive, and I have to download it and upload it, or a WeTransfer, that's a time consuming process to me. And whilst it only takes a few minutes, times that few minutes by the hundreds of emails. And so I think a low res image and being then really fast with a high res image if we request it, that's really important too.
We've got another question as well from Nita. If you've done the top 10 cheese, so you've already covered that, but then is it worth sending you for next time the top 10 cheeses or something cheese related so you can keep them on file for another cheese story you may be doing? Or would that kind of get lost?
I think that's the problem, isn't it? I love that we've taken the top 10 cheeses on. Thanks, Nita. That's made me quite happy. The thing is, if we've done cheese, we've done cheese, and we're not going to be looking at cheese for another month or two. That's kind of the point of that. So, but so you could try, but you'll be lucky if you get a response. It might go on file, but I mean, cheese is obviously just a silly suggestion. I'm just trying to think that sometimes, so it'd be more likely for us to be like diet or exercise or sugar-free something is what I'm just thinking of. But if we've already done like a sugar-free diet and you go, God, I've got this great book on how to kick sugar, I'm going to be like, well, I'll just keep that to one side and maybe I'll pick it up. But it's going to be a good few months before we go back to that topic.
You talked before as well about having relationships with PRs. If you're obviously looking for a story and you're struggling to find some content, would you reach out to ones that you've already got contacts with, or would you tend to put something on Twitter, on journal request or whatever, or kind of, as I say, reach out to somebody you've done work with in the past?
I mean, it's a bit of both, to be honest with you. I do a lot with publishers and publicists and publishing, and often I'm like, what have you got? What's going on with you at the moment? And often if I say no to an idea, I might say, but have you got anything else? Or there's a very few PRs that I will go back to and approach directly. But if I put something out, like say on Twitter or Response Source, and a PR I've worked with before who's been really great, who gets back to me, I will probably look at their emails slightly more carefully than I might someone else's.
Do you ever find as well, I sometimes see on Twitter, I follow lots of conversations between journalists and PRs, and obviously most of the time it's very fruitful, but sometimes there can be a little bit of a spat on there. Do you ever find that people let you down? I know that's something that journalists get quite upset with, is set something up and they've got you an interview with the CEO and then they don't like the interview, etc., or something along those lines.
There's always times where maybe you've been overpromised and people can't deliver. Yeah, of course there is. That happens with writers too, though, not just PRs. I like to think I'm very understanding of PRs. I think it's a really tricky job, and I'm freelance as well. I'm actually working at a maternity cover, so I've dealt with PRs for like 20 odd years, and actually PRs have helped me as a freelance place stories, because they know that actually sometimes it's better to go through a freelance than to approach an editor directly because of that personal connection freelancers have. So that's also something to think about. And so I know that some journalists are quite disparaging about PRs and they can be a bit sniffy about PRs, but I just don't think that's fair. I think sometimes things do fall down and it's not necessarily the PR's fault. And I think sometimes, so for example, actually recently, that didn't happen to me, it happened to a colleague. We got some quotes for a nutrition piece, and then the PR was like, oh, I'll give you the right name to attribute them to. And then just went AWOL, and we couldn't get the quote, we couldn't get the expert's name, and then the PR clearly just made up some quotes. And that just meant our journalists had to go and find someone else really last minute to re-interview, get the quotes that we needed for the piece. And it was just all a bit unnecessary. And to be fair, I was like, well, what's the PR's name? Because I want to know, because now that PR isn't coming anywhere near what, we will share information if you do something really ridiculous. Not if something isn't your fault, but if you just disappear and you don't say, I'm really sorry, this has happened, it's out of my control. We could be like, fine, because we don't actually care. We're like, right, fine, we need to go and find what we need from somewhere else. We just need to get our job done. And if that hasn't worked out from your end of things, we'd just rather know earlier than later.
Sure. It's all about relationships, isn't it? I think in every industry, particularly in this sector. Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly who's joined us today. I know some names here. I think it's mainly sort of agency or freelance. At the moment, obviously, the present climate, the last 6 months and going into this lockdown too, and we don't know how long this will last, most people are working at home. And talking to, I know some people on here today from their maybe more junior members of staff, they're struggling a little bit sometimes having that comfort of working with colleagues and listening into how you pitch, how you don't pitch, helping them with all sorts of different things. Are there any sort of tips you would give from working kind of in the media on both sides to anybody who's maybe, people starting a job working from home at the moment where they haven't got the support network and that learning environment? What sort of tips would you give to them at this time?
I do think it's really tough. I think my top tips are actually just be sort of kind to yourself, but also remember that the journalist you're speaking to, whilst we can be rude and horrible, and I apologise for all my colleagues that have ever been rude and horrible to you, is that we're also kind of juggling like our lives as well. Many of us have got young kids, many of us are working on cramped kitchen tables, and many of us are worried about losing our jobs. And So just if someone's maybe a bit short with you, don't take it really personally. Just kind of think, okay, take a deep breath and move on. And if they did give you anything constructive, try and take that with you. But I think reading publications, knowing what sort of content they cover, and just kind of working out, as Lee said, lead times are really important. You know, there's no point contacting a monthly magazine with a really great Christmas idea right now, because they've had Christmas wrapped up. They've probably just sewn up Valentine's Day and they're looking at Easter right now. So you need to be really aware of that. And that's a really hard thing to do. And I think if you are struggling, you need to speak to your line manager or your mentor and get a bit of help and feedback.
That's great. That was useful, I thought.
I think there's a couple more questions, Lisa. I just can't see, I can see the last one, but not the one before that.
Yeah, the one before was from Zach. It said, do you ever forward on interesting pitches to your colleagues which may not be exactly relevant for you?
Yeah, all the time. I'm always saying, if something's to health, I'll forward it to my health editor, or I'll say to the PR, try this person on health, or I'll say, try this person on features, this isn't for us. And I will forward it on, or I'll give you a name. And actually when they're freelance writers, I'm sometimes like, oh, try this publication, it'd be much better for them. Because I've written for most magazines and newspapers, so I'm pretty confident I can place most pieces. But so yeah, we do that. We're not, you know, within the company, we're not in competition with each other. And actually, if it's not right for us, I don't really mind where it goes, you know.
A quick question from Nikki here. Do you have any tips on how best to build relationships with journalists as a PR graduate?
Yeah, it's really hard. I do feel for you. I think just being really helpful and just really understanding. I've got one PR who is just so, and I don't even know, it's so over the top. She's so like darling, lovey. She's like, the first time she emailed me, she was like, just so OTT. And for me, I just don't mind that. I just think it's quite like light relief. I'm not saying you should be, it's just her personality. And she's actually quite an experienced PR as well. But I'm saying don't feel like you need to be someone you're not, but also don't be afraid. I mean, I think journalists often complain about over familiarity from a PR, so just be careful with that. You can't be like, hi babe, because that can really bother journalists. I mean, I don't know why it bothers them, I just ignore that, but I know I see a lot of journalist groups going, I can't believe this PR. My top tip though is make sure you've got everything spelled correctly, make sure your grammar's correct, because if you have mistakes in your first communication with us, we're going to be slightly more doubtful about trusting what's going to follow that. So always just read through your emails. Make sure you don't address something to me that you've previously sent to. I know you've cut and pasted it from sending it to the Daily Mail earlier and they've just said no. But I often get emails saying, hey, this would be great for the Daily Mail female section. And you know what? I will just delete that, because I think, you know, if you can't be bothered to check your email is for the right person, and it makes me laugh. I've done it before myself. It makes you human, but just there are small things you can do to ingratiate yourself. And like I said, and when journalists do ask you for things like prices, stockists, high res, the faster you get them back, the better their life feels. You just don't want to be that name where we're like saying, no, not going to work with them again.
And we did have a question from Saskia. I don't think Lee said you can see it, but what sort of content is most likely to grab the lifestyle team's attention? So top 10 lists, case studies, survey stories, product launches, etc. And are there any types of content you are likely to disregard straight away?
Good question. It often depends on the whim of editors, but we do like case studies. We like real people in our pages. Anything too heavily sort of branded, if you're sort of thinking, what does my client need? What does my client want to hear? As opposed to what does a newspaper want to make this really lifestyle-y? That's kind of the balance that you've got to find. So we're always interested in new products. If it's too expensive, like it has to be kind of, if it's quirky, it might go, if it's just a kind of regular sort of everyday product and it's just got a really high price point, and think about which publication you're pitching to. You know, the Telegraph will obviously have a higher price point than the People, so you know, think about that sort of thing, because you could have a great idea, but if it's just too expensive it might not work. And just anything that's quite zeitgeisty, and like I said, if there's something that celebrities are chatting about, it's just useful for us to be like, hey, this is what's kind of going on in celeb world, but here's how you can have a piece of it yourself and afford it.
Debbie, thank you so much. I'm really conscious of time, so if nobody else has any more questions, I think we'll love you and leave you there. I hope everyone's found that as useful as I have. Thank you so much again for your time and for being here.